James McPherson is a noted American Civil War historian who won the 1989 Pulitzer Prize for the battle cry of freedom, the Civil War era. He is the George Henry Davis 1986 Professor Emeritus of United States History at Princeton University. In 2000, Dr. McPherson was named the Jefferson Lecturer in the Humanities by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and in 2003 he served as president of the American Historical Association. His other books include Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, This Mighty Scourge, Perspectives on the Civil War, War on the Waters, The Union and Confederate Navies, 1861 to 1865, and The Struggle for Equality, which received the Anisfield Wolf Award from the Cleveland Foundation for its contributions to society's understanding of racism and the appreciation of diversity of cultures. Jim is known for his work on behalf of the preservation of many Civil War battlefields, serving as president of Protect Historic America and on the boards of the Civil War Trust, the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, and the Civil War Sites Advisory Committee. I happen to think Jim's most important job is serving on the board of directors of the Gettysburg Foundation. So Jim, welcome, and please give a warm welcome to Jim McPherson.
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thanks to all of you for your warm welcome. Joanne and the Gettysburg Foundation, as partners of the National Park Service, are responsible for the administration of this battlefield and the visitor center and for all of the events that you're taking part in today, tomorrow, and next week. So I would like you to give her a hand and give her staff a hand. As I think most of you are probably aware, for many decades the National Park Service is self-guided as well as ranger-guided tours at Gettysburg, climaxed at the farthest point reached by Pickett's charge as the high water mark of the Confederacy. William Faulkner enshrined this trope in a memorable passage in his 1948 novel, Intruder in the Dust. For every Southern boy, he meant every white Southern boy. For every Southern boy 14 years old, Faulkner wrote, there's the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence, the guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out. And Pickett himself, with his long oiled ringlets and his hat in one hand probably and his sword in the other, looking up the hill, waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. And that moment doesn't need even a 14-year-old boy to think, this time, maybe this time, with all this much to lose and all this much to gain, Pennsylvania, Maryland, the world, the Golden Dome of Washington itself, to crown with desperate and unbelievable victory the desperate gamble the cast made 2 years ago. Although the National Park Service and its partner, the Gettysburg Foundation, have changed the dominant theme here at Gettysburg from high water mark to new birth of freedom, the park still maintains the high water mark trail. It takes the visitor to the monument marking the spot where General Lewis Armistead, commander of one of Pickett's brigades, broke through the Union line and placed his hand on one of Alonzo Cushing's guns before falling mortally wounded, which Cushing also did, while the Confederate soldiers who had followed him were also shot down or captured, and the wave of attackers retreated toward their starting point, and the high tide of the Confederacy receded toward ultimate defeat. Never mind that the war lasted another 21 months, and the Confederates still had a chance to win by outlasting the North's willingness to continue fighting in the summer of 1864, until Union victories and Lincoln's re-election finally assured Northern victory. The metaphor of a high tide at Gettysburg remains a powerful one. so potent that people from Virginia and from North Carolina continued to quarrel about whose troops got farther in what it is now proper, in recognition of North Carolina's contribution, to describe as the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. That high water image will probably never disappear, especially since there are other ways also to view the Gettysburg campaign as a high water mark for both sides, at least in its potential, if not its reality. Even the theme of a new birth of freedom, taken of course from President Lincoln's famous address at the dedication of the cemetery, is capable of a high water mark interpretation. The birth of a child is a joyous occasion, perhaps the most joyous in a family's life, when the future seems boundless. The sky is the limit. The tide of growth will overcome all obstacles. So it might have seemed on that bright November day in 1863 when Lincoln proclaimed a new birth of freedom here at Gettysburg. But we need to turn the clock back a year or more from November 1863 to provide a context for considering Gettysburg as any sort of high water mark. It was General Robert E. Lee and his commander-in-chief Jefferson Davis whose military strategy produced the invasion that led to the Battle of Gettysburg. A fundamental assumption underlay that strategy. Lee believed that the North's greater population and resources would make Union victory inevitable in a prolonged war of attrition, so long as the Northern people had the will to employ those resources. The only way the Confederacy could achieve its independence, Lee thought, was to win battlefield victories while the South still had the strength to do so, victories that would, if possible, cripple the enemy's main army and demoralize the Northern people to the point that they became convinced that to continue the fight was not worth the cost in lives and resources. Lee believed that these battlefield victories could not be won by sitting back and waiting for the enemy to take the initiative. The only time he did that, at least before 1864, was at Fredericksburg in December 1862. A defensive victory that Lee found frustrating because the defeated enemy was able to cross back over the Rappahannock River without further harm. Even at Antietam, where the Confederates fought a tactically defensive battle except for localized counterattacks, the battle itself was the culmination of Lee's strategic offensive. During that battle, and even the day after it, Lee looked for ways to take the tactical offensive even with his exhausted and depleted army. And following his retreat across the Potomac River after Antietam, Lee still wanted to recross into Maryland farther upriver to continue his offensive and expressed frustration at his army's inability to do so. From the moment he had taken command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862, Lee had sought openings for a knockout blow. After driving McClellan back to the James River in the 7 Days battles, Lee did not bask in his victory, but instead lamented, "Our success has not been as great or as complete as I could have desired. Under ordinary circumstances, the Federal Army should have been destroyed." Destroyed! Such an outcome would have been a high water mark indeed, with no ebbing of the tide afterward. That Napoleonic vision persisted as Lee's goal for the next year. Just as Napoleon had destroyed enemy armies at Austerlitz and Jena Auerstadt, forcing Austria, Russia, and Prussia to sue for peace on his terms, Lee hoped for similar, if perhaps less spectacular, results from the 7 Days, from the invasion of Maryland in 1862, and from the invasion of Pennsylvania in 1863. In the Antietam and Gettysburg campaigns, Lee linked his military initiatives to proposals for parallel political initiatives. After his victory at Second Manassas, he had written to Jefferson Davis that he believed the enemy was, as Lee put it, much weakened and demoralized. Now was the time for that knockout blow. Braxton Bragg's and Edmund Kirby Smith's armies were invading Kentucky at the same time that Lee's men crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. In a Napoleonic proclamation to his troops on September 6, 1862, Lee declared, "Soldiers, press onward. Let the armies of the East and the West vie with each other in discipline, bravery, and activity, and our brethren of our sister states, Maryland and Kentucky, will soon be released from tyranny, and our independence be established on a sure and abiding basis." Lee was an avid reader of Northern newspapers smuggled across the lines, from which he gleaned not only bits of military intelligence, but also information about Northern politics and the growing disillusionment with the war among Democrats and despair among many Republicans. One of Lee's purposes in the Maryland campaign was to intensify that demoralization in the hope of strengthening anti-war candidates in the Northern congressional elections of 1862. If Democrats could gain control of the House, it might undermine the Lincoln administration's ability to carry on the war. On September 8, 1862, Lee outlined his ideas in a letter to Jefferson Davis. "The present posture of affairs," the general wrote, "places it in our power to propose to the Union government the recognition of our independence. Such a proposal," he continued, "coming when it is in our power to inflict injury on our adversary, would enable the people of the United States to determine at their coming elections whether they will support those who favor a prolongation of the war, that is, the Republicans, or those who wish to bring it to a termination, the Peace Democrats." As things turned out, of course, Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia after the Battle of Antietam. There was no opportunity for Jefferson Davis to propose any kind of negotiations, and the outcome of the Northern congressional elections was equivocal. Although Democrats did make significant gains in the House, Republicans retained control of Congress. But morale in the Army of the Potomac and among the Northern public plunged to a new low water mark in the early months of 1863 after the disaster at Fredericksburg, the fiasco of the Mud March, and the failure of General Grant's initial efforts at Vicksburg to accomplish anything. Copperhead Democrats became more outspoken and politically powerful than ever. Lee followed these developments closely. In February, he secretly ordered Stonewall Jackson's skilled topographical engineer, Jedediah Hotchkiss, to draw detailed maps of south central Pennsylvania from Cumberland Valley to Harrisburg and all the way east to Philadelphia. Now, Lee didn't give Hotchkiss such an assignment just because he liked to read maps. And about this time also, Lee read in Northern newspapers of General McClellan's testimony before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, about the finding of Lee's Special Orders number 191 in the Antietam campaign. This news solved the mystery for Lee of why McClellan had moved more quickly and aggressively than Lee had anticipated. That revelation may have convinced Lee that only an unlucky accident had frustrated his goals for the first invasion of the North. With better luck and tighter security, he might succeed on a second try. The Army of the Potomac would soon become weaker as the terms of 30,000 of its two-year men who enlisted in 1861 and 9 months militia enrolled in 1862 began to expire. Now was the time, Lee believed, to strike again with an invasion to force the enemy into the open for another blow to discourage Northern morale. Lee wrote to his wife on April 19th, that if successful this year, next fall there will be a great change in public opinion at the North. The Republicans will be destroyed, and I think the Friends of Peace will go in on that basis. Before Lee could begin to implement that vision, however, General Joe Hooker struck first on the Rappahannock. Lee countered, sent Jackson on his famous flank march, mesmerized Hooker, and forced him to hunker down in his trenches north of the Chancellor Mansion that gave its name to the battle. Intending to throw his knockout punch right there, if he could, Lee was again disappointed when Hooker slipped away across the river on the night of May 5th and 6th, 1863. Although Southerners celebrated Chancellorsville as a great victory, albeit one marred by the death of Stonewall Jackson, to Lee it was another empty triumph that left the enemy to fight another day. The South would only get weaker and the North stronger if the war went on much longer. The men and horses of the Army of Northern Virginia were on half rations as the Confederacy's economy and rail network continued to deteriorate, and the Anaconda blockade squeezed the South ever more tightly. Food and forage, as well as the opportunity to maneuver the enemy into a position where Lee could fight him to advantage, beckoned from here in Pennsylvania. Before he could do so, though, Lee had to overcome a competing strategic option. General James Longstreet and several members of the Confederate cabinet suggested that Longstreet should take 2 of his divisions to the Western Theater, either to reinforce Braxton Bragg for an offensive against General William Rosecrans in Middle Tennessee, or to reinforce Joseph Johnston in Mississippi to help him break down the campaign of Ulysses S. Grant against Vicksburg. Lee objected strongly to those proposals. He argued that a successful invasion of Pennsylvania would force Grant and Rosecrans to loosen their grip and would win the war by disabling the North's largest army, the Army of the Potomac. Lee's prestige overcame all opposition. His vision won over Jefferson Davis. Most interesting of all, it won over Longstreet, who wrote on May 13th that an invasion of Pennsylvania offered the best opportunity, as Longstreet put it, either to destroy the Yankees or bring them to terms. Lee and his army exuded confidence as they started north in June 1863. On June 23rd, Confederate Division Commander Dorsey Pender wrote to his wife, "It is stated on all sides that Hooker has a small army and that it is very much demoralized. General Lee says he wants to meet him as soon as possible." Lee himself told another division commander, John Bell Hood, that the Army of Northern Virginia was, in Lee's words, invincible. They will go anywhere and do anything if properly led. Proper leadership after Jackson's death and other Chancellorsville casualties was a problem, to be sure. Lee reorganized the Army into 3 corps, with Generals Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill as new corps commanders. Their record as division commanders under Jackson and Longstreet's reputation as a powerful counterpuncher gave promise of vigorous, hard-hitting leadership in this bid to carry the gray tide of the Army of Northern Virginia over the metaphorical seawall of the Mason-Dixon line. And as he had done during the invasion of Maryland the previous September, Lee again offered political advice to Jefferson Davis. Lee's reading of Northern newspapers had convinced him, as he put it, that the rising peace party of the North, as he described the Copperheads, offered the Confederacy a means of dividing and weakening our enemies. Lee acknowledged in his letter of June 10th to Jefferson Davis that the Copperheads professed to favor reunion as the purpose of the negotiations they were urging, while the Confederate goal in any such parley would of course be independence. But it would do no harm, Lee advised Davis, to play along with such reunion sentiment to weaken Northern support for the war, which, as Lee put it, which after all is what we are interested in bringing about. When peace is proposed to us, it will be time enough to discuss its terms, and it is not the part of prudence to spurn the proposition in advance merely because those who made it believe or affect to believe that it will result in bringing us back to the Union. Lee concluded his letter with a broad hint that Davis will know best how to give effect to my views. Davis did indeed think he knew a way to offer the olive branch of a victorious peace at the same time that Lee's sword won that victory in the field. Not long after he received Lee's letter, Davis also opened one from Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, suggesting a mission to Washington under flag of truce. The ostensible purpose would be a negotiation to renew the cartel for prisoner of war exchanges, which had broken down or was in the process of breaking down because of the Confederate threat to execute or re-enslave captured officers and men of black regiments. But Stephens said that if Lincoln received him, he could also propose a general adjustment to end the war on the basis of a Northern agreement to the sovereignty of a state to determine its own destiny. Davis immediately summoned Stephens from Georgia to undertake the mission by joining Lee in Pennsylvania and looking for an opening to proceed to Washington. Stephens had not previously known about Lee's invasion. He objected that the Union government would never receive him while an enemy army was on Northern soil. To the contrary, said Davis, that was precisely the time to negotiate from a position of strength that would force concessions from the Lincoln administration. The Confederate cabinet backed Davis, so Stephens reluctantly agreed to go. It was too late to catch up with Lee in Pennsylvania, so Stephens instead headed down the James River under flag of truce to Union lines at Fort Monroe, where he arrived on July 2nd and had word sent to Lincoln requesting a pass to come to Washington. To jump ahead in that story, Stephens's message arrived in Washington at almost the same time on July 4th as news of the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln replied curtly that Stephens's request was inadmissible. Earlier, however, rumors of the Stephens mission had surfaced in the Richmond press. An editorial in the Richmond Examiner declared, "The present movement of General Lee will be of infinite value as disclosing the easy susceptibility of the North to invasion. Not even the Chinese are less prepared by previous habits of life and education for martial resistance than the Yankees. We can carry our armies far into the enemy's country, exacting peace by blows leveled at his vitals." Lee thought so too. On June 27th, he talked candidly with Major General Isaac Trimble, who would lose his leg 6 days later, leading 2 brigades in the Pickett-Pettigrew assault. According to Trimble, Lee told him on that day, when most of the Army of Northern Virginia was at Chambersburg, that when the enemy hear where we are, they will make forced marches, probably through Frederick, broken down with hunger and hard marching, strung out on a long line and much demoralized when they come into Pennsylvania. I shall throw an overwhelming force on their advance, crush it, follow up the success, drive one corps back on another, and by successive repulses and surprises, before they can concentrate, create a panic and destroy the army. Then the war will be over and we shall achieve recognition of our independence. Here indeed was a plan for a Confederate high water mark that would wash away all hopes for preservation of the Union. Trimble wrote these words 20 years later, and perhaps we might question their literal accuracy, even though Trimble said the conversation was vivid in his memory and he was confident that he quoted Lee correctly. In any event, Lee's decisions and orders here at Gettysburg were consistent with the statements recorded by Trimble. Over and over again, Lee ordered attack after attack, almost as if to make his predictions to Trimble come true, if he could. At almost the moment of Lee's conversation with Trimble, the dynamic on the Union side was changing. General Hooker had offered his resignation as Army commander after quarreling with General-in-Chief Henry W. Halleck over control of the Union troops at Harper's Ferry. By offering to resign, Hooker hoped to force Lincoln to overrule Halleck and give him control of those troops. But the president surprised Hooker by accepting his resignation and appointing George Gordon Meade in his place. Lincoln had lost faith in Hooker, and he agreed with a consensus of Corps commanders that Meade was the best man for the job. Meade's instructions, like those to Hooker, were to keep his army between the invading enemy and Washington, and to fight the enemy when and where he could do so to advantage. Meade decided to dig in along Pipe Creek, a few miles south of the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, where he could cover both Washington and Baltimore. But the fates decreed that there would be no Battle of Pipe Creek. Instead, the biggest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere would begin 20 miles to the northwest, when Union cavalry clashed with Confederate infantry west of Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st. And officers on both sides sent couriers pounding down the roads to summon reinforcements to this county seat and college town, where a dozen roads concentrated from all points of the compass like the spokes of a wheel. By 2:30 that afternoon, those reinforcements included Robert E. Lee, and by midnight, George Gordon Meade, who thereafter confronted each other in this titanic collision that would shape the rest of their lives. As Lee arrived near Hare's Tavern on July 1st, he expressed frustration at his lack of knowledge about what was going on. He had received no scouting reports from his cavalry chief, Jeb Stuart, for nearly a week, which had left him operating blind in the enemy's country. Stuart had taken his best 3 cavalry brigades on a raid behind Union lines and had been cut off from his own army, while the rest of Lee's cavalry was operating too far off to provide information on the location of the Army of the Potomac. Lee was also upset because General Henry Heath, the division commander whose troops had attacked Union cavalry thinking they were only local militia, had brought on a general engagement in violation of Lee's orders not to do so until the whole army was concentrated. Meade was better served by his cavalry under General John Buford, who had been sending frequent reports about the Confederate invaders, and who made the decision to confront them on July 1st to hold the hills and ridges around Gettysburg as a prime defensive position until infantry reinforcements under General John Reynolds marching up from the south could get there. Meade also had other sources of intelligence that gave him an advantage over Lee in that vital respect. Several months earlier, Hooker had created the Bureau of Military Information and put Colonel George Sharp in charge. Sharp pioneered the practice of all-source intelligence, which kept Meade well informed about the location, size, and distribution of enemy forces. Because of these advantages, the balance of potential power between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia began slowly and subtly to shift on that fateful July 1st. But for the time being, Lee still held the initiative and was determined to keep it. The Confederates managed to get more troops to Gettysburg that day than the Union. 2 of Ewell's divisions swept down from the north during the afternoon to reinforce Heath's and Dorsey Pender's division coming from the west. Union General Reynolds had been killed that morning while leading the Iron Brigade into action against one of Heath's brigades. The 1st and highest ranking of 4 Union generals and 5 Confederate generals to be killed or mortally wounded during the next 3 days. As Jubal Early's division began to overrun the right flank of the Union 11th Corps about 4 p.m., Lee cast off his uncertainty and ordered all of his troops on hand to attack. They broke the Union lines and drove the remnants back through the town to Cemetery Hill, which General Oliver Otis Howard had fortified with ample artillery and a reserve brigade of infantry. Lee considered Cemetery Hill the key to the battlefield, the true high water mark of his attack. If his soldiers could seize that position, he believed the demoralized enemy would break up. So Lee gave verbal orders to Ewell to attack and carry Cemetery Hill if practicable. Ewell reconnoitered the position, consulted subordinates, and hesitated. His men were suffering from fatigue and thirst after a long march and intense fighting. Ewell could see that the Union position on the hill was formidable. He suspected, correctly, that newly arriving Union troops were within supporting distance. So he decided that it was not practicable to attack. Overnight, Union reinforcements were able to consolidate their position on Cemetery Hill and to occupy Culp's Hill to the east and a line running down Cemetery Ridge to Little Round Top to the south. When Meade arrived at Cemetery Hill at midnight, he made the decision to stand and fight on this high ground. He conceived that his orders from Washington required him to remain on the defensive. He would cede Lee the initiative in order to retain the advantage of a strong defensive position. Lee willingly accepted that challenge. His fighting blood was up. He still believed his army invincible and the enemy demoralized. As Lee and Longstreet surveyed the Union lines through binoculars from the high ground of the Lutheran Theological Seminary on the morning of July 2nd, Longstreet remarked on the strength of the enemy position. A skilled defensive commander and counterpuncher, Longstreet urged Lee to take the army south toward Washington and find a good defensive position of its own. Meade would be compelled to follow and to attack, giving the Confederates the ability to repeat the successful tactics of 2nd Manassas and Fredericksburg. Lee would have none of it. Those battles had not won the war, and he was looking for a war-winning battle in Pennsylvania. Pointing toward Cemetery Hill, Lee said, "The enemy is there, and I'm going to attack him there." Longstreet replied, as he later reported, "If he is there, it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him. A good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so." But Lee had made up his mind. Longstreet turned away sadly, as he wrote years later, with a conviction of impending disaster. After initially ordering Ewell to attack Cemetery and Culp's Hills that morning, Lee took a closer look and agreed that the Union positions there were too strong and the approaches too difficult. So he ordered Longstreet to attack the Union left, sweep northward along the Emmitsburg Road and Cemetery Ridge to carry Cemetery Hill from the south. Ewell would demonstrate against the enemy in his front and convert that demonstration into an assault if Meade weakened that flank to reinforce his left. When Longstreet's attack finally went forward about 4 p.m., it carried Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard, the Trossel farm, but was stopped short of Little Round Top. The one penetration of Cemetery Ridge by Ambrose Wright's Georgia Brigade was driven back by a counterattack. Other localized counterattacks by the 20th Maine and 1st Minnesota heroically blunted potential Confederate breakthroughs. Meade and his subordinates skillfully plugged holes with reserves and reinforcements. 5 of the 6 brigades defending Culp's Hill were shifted to the left, enabling Ewell to occupy the Union trenches on Lower Culp's Hill But George Greene's remaining brigade of New Yorkers stopped them at the edge of the main part of the hill, while Colonel Samuel Carroll's brigade counterattacked to close a potential breach on East Cemetery Hill. Despite the failure to break the main Union line, Lee believed that his indomitable veterans had won the day. One more push, he thought, and the enemy would finally break. George Pickett's fresh infantry division and Jeb Stuart's jaded cavalry division had finally arrived. Lee began to plan how he would use them to spearhead that push. Across the lines, Meade called a council of war of his corps commanders to consult about their plans for the next day. They voted unanimously to stay and fight, but to remain on the defensive. That decision gave Lee his opportunity to renew the attacks, though Longstreet again urged Lee to break off and maneuver to the south to pull Meade out of his defenses. But Lee was no more in the mood for such a move than he had been 24 hours earlier. "The enemy is there," he said, pointing toward the Union lines, "and I'm going to take them where they are." That high water mark of Cemetery Hill still beckoned. Lee worked out a three-pronged plan of attack to reach it. Ewell was to renew the previous evening's efforts to carry Culp's Hill and to move toward the rear of Cemetery Hill. Stuart would take his cavalry around to a position to the east and circle back to come in on the rear of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge. If all worked as planned, they would complete the rout of Union forces accomplished there by the main attack of Pickett's division and two of A.P. Hill's divisions on the Union center. Longstreet was depressed by Lee's orders for him to launch this main assault. "It is my opinion," he said, he later told Lee, "that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." But Lee insisted that they try, and try they did. By the time Pickett's men and the other divisions stepped out of the woods along Seminary Ridge to begin their march across 3/4 of a mile of open ground at 3 p.m., however, the other two parts of Lee's plan for July 3rd had already failed or were in the process of failing. Ewell's fight at Culp's Hill had been forced prematurely by a Union attack at dawn to recapture the abandoned trenches on Lower Culp's Hill, producing a 6 to 7 hour firefight in which the Confederates were driven off Culp's Hill altogether. Stuart's troopers ran into Union horsemen 3 miles to the east and were stopped cold in a clash that featured two mounted charges led by the newly promoted Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. At about the same time as the second of these two cavalry charges took place, the high tide of the Pickett-Pettigrew assault was receding across the blood-strewn fields between Cemetery and Seminary Ridges. Of the 42 Confederate regiments that took part in that attack, 28 lost their colors, by far the highest total for any one action in the war. Half of the men in those 42 regiments were killed, wounded, or captured. All but one of the 15 regimental commanders in Pickett's division were killed or wounded. This attack was one of the great disasters of the war, yet it continues to be celebrated in history and myth as a courageous and noble effort in which Southern honor knew no finer hour. But perhaps it was really General Meade who knew no finer hour. As the Confederates fell back, the initiative clearly went over to him. Lee and Longstreet worked feverishly to patch together some kind of a defense along Seminary Ridge against an expected counterattack. Some of Meade's subordinates, including a wounded General Winfield Scott Hancock, urged him to launch a counterattack using part of the 6th Corps, which had been held in reserve, to spearhead it. But Meade could not make the quick psychological shift from defense to offense. He had been in command for only 6 days, 3 of them fighting for his army's survival. He had had little sleep during that time, "We have done well enough," he said to a cavalry officer who wanted to counterattack. Meade later explained that he did not want to follow, these are his words, "the bad example Lee had set me in ruining himself attacking a strong position." Next day, the 4th of July, as Lee gave orders for his army to begin the long retreat to Virginia, elements of the Union 5th and 6th Corps moved out from the vicinity of the Round Tops to probe the Confederate positions. Was this the beginning of a counterattack? Impossible to say, because heavy rain began to fall and continued intermittently for several days, slowing operations to a crawl. This rain also brought about a quite different, and this time literal rather than metaphorical, high water mark. The rise in the Potomac River made it unfordable at Williamsport, Maryland, where Lee had intended to cross into Virginia. At the same time, Union cavalry destroyed the Confederate pontoon bridge at Falling Waters downriver from Williamsport. The Army of Northern Virginia was trapped north of the Potomac for what in the end amounted to 10 days after the Battle of Gettysburg. Northern cavalry snapped at the heels of the retreating Confederates, capturing several thousand stragglers and recapturing some of the supplies the Confederates had seized from Pennsylvania farms and towns. Lee's retreat turned into a nightmare of mud and misery. Meade pursued with his reinforced army, but too slowly for the impatient commander-in-chief in Washington, who saw in this situation a golden opportunity to turn the high water in the Potomac into a high water mark for the Union cause, especially when news arrived of the surrender of Vicksburg to Grant on the 4th of July, and also the success of Rosecrans' offensive in Middle Tennessee. But when Lincoln read the congratulatory order that Meade issued to his army for its victory at Gettysburg, his face fell. "Our task is not yet accomplished," Meade told his army, "and the commanding general looks to the army for greater efforts to drive from our soil every vestige of the invader." "Great God, is that all?" burst out the president when he read these words. "This is a dreadful reminiscence of McClellan. Will our generals never get that idea out of their heads? The whole country is our soil." More temperately, Lincoln had General-in-Chief Halleck fire off telegrams to Meade urging him to push forward and fight Lee before he can cross the Potomac. "The president is urgent and anxious that your army should move against him by forced marches." When Lee learned on July 7th of the capture of Vicksburg, he had Halleck send a telegram informing Meade of this news and adding, "Now, if General Meade can complete his work so gloriously begun so far, by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over." From Meade came promises to try, but also reports of supply difficulties, roads of bottomless mud, the exhaustion of his men, and a strong defensive perimeter established by Lee at Williamsport, while his engineers feverishly tore down buildings for lumber to rebuild the pontoon bridge. Lincoln had heard it all before, and he must have sighed with exasperation. But on July 11th, John Hay reported the president to be in especially good humor today, because Meade had telegraphed his intention of attacking them in the morning. But instead of news of an attack on July 12th, there came another telegram from Meade that he would attack the next morning, unless something intervenes. When Lincoln read this dispatch, his shoulders sagged, and he remarked, "They will be ready to fight a magnificent battle when there is no enemy to fight." He was right. The something that intervened was a council of war that Meade held with his 7 senior generals, at which a majority voted not to attack, but instead to reconnoiter the enemy's line for a possible weak spot. When the Army of the Potomac's infantry finally did lurch forward on the morning of July 14th, 3 hours after dawn, they found no enemy to fight. The Army of Northern Virginia had crossed during the night and early morning on the rebuilt pontoon bridge and at a ford. The river had dropped just enough. Union cavalry had gone forward at first light and captured about 1,000 men, maybe 1,500, of the rear guard. If the infantry had advanced earlier, they might have captured more. When the news of Lee's escape reached Washington, Lincoln was bitter. "That, by God, is the last of this Army of the Potomac," he exploded to Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles. "There is bad faith somewhere." Welles wrote that only once or twice before have I seen the president so troubled, so dejected, and discouraged. Halleck conveyed Lincoln's dissatisfaction to Meade, who immediately submitted his resignation. That would never do. To sack the general acclaimed as the hero of Gettysburg would make the administration look foolish, if not worse. In a dispatch that constituted a quasi-apology, Halleck informed Meade that his resignation could not be accepted. Lincoln sat down to write a letter intended to mollify Meade. "I am very, very grateful to you for the magnificent success you gave the cause of the country at Gettysburg," the president began. But as his pen scratched over the paper, Lincoln's words strayed far from those of congratulation and apology. "My dear General," Lincoln continued, "I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it." As he blotted the ink and read over this letter, Lincoln realized that he could not send it unless he really did want to provoke Meade's resignation. So he filed it away. But while Lincoln's mood soon improved, he never changed his mind about Meade's missed opportunity. Was Lincoln right about that? Officers in the Army of the Potomac who subsequently studied the Confederate defensive perimeter at Williamsport, situated on high ground with interlocking fields of fire, concluded that an attack probably would have failed with great loss. Most modern historians seem to agree. On the other hand, this Confederate line was 10 miles in length, and Lee had at most 45,000 men to hold it. By way of comparison, the Union fishhook line at Gettysburg was less than 3 miles long, with at least 60,000 men to defend it on July 3rd. We can never know whether an attack at Williamsport on July 12th or 13th would have succeeded or failed, and at what cost. But even a limited success, even at the cost of several thousand more casualties, if it had further damaged Lee's army and perhaps shortened the war, would have compared favorably with 21 more months of war and at least 300,000 more deaths during that time. The high water mark of the Union came at Appomattox. Perhaps Lincoln was right that it could have come at Williamsport. Well, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, and so I'll be glad to recognize you. Somebody right here.
Well, of course, I've made the observation, like you have, that there have been so many books written about Gettysburg, and we often feel like we know too much about Gettysburg. But is there any mythology that surrounds Gettysburg that needs to be dispelled? If you could just think of one example. I kind of think of how important, because we've had him in the movies, Chamberlain and the Little Round Top, that gets exaggerated sometimes. And, of course, whenever you write about your experiences, you tend to get your point of view across, and the other people who didn't write something don't tend to get their point of view. But anyway, if you could just talk about one major myth about Gettysburg, I'd appreciate it.
Well, since you bring up Chamberlain and Little Round Top, I won't talk so much about a myth as I will talk about a comparison, and my comparison would be David Ireland at Culp's Hill. where the 137th New York, his regiment, held the opposite flank and came under heavy attack by the Confederates, much of it taking place after dark on the evening of July 2nd, and held that position against serious threat to overrun it. Doing many of the same things that Chamberlain had done about 2 hours earlier at Little Round Top, including refusing the line, ordering a bayonet attack counterattack by a couple of companies of the 137th New York. When I take people on a tour of Gettysburg, I try to point out that that was just as important in saving the Union flank on the right, a couple of miles away from Chamberlain's heroics on the left. And Chamberlain, of course, later wrote a great deal about that, and then we had a great novel about it, The Killer Angels, and the movie, and we had Ken Burns' series which focused on Chamberlain. But David Ireland, whose regiment, along with the rest of the 12th Corps, was shifted to Chattanooga and then fought in the Georgia campaign for the rest of the war, died during that campaign and never had a chance to write about it. So we don't know as much about that, and nobody ever wrote a novel about it or made a movie about it. But I would say that that's one thing that could use some greater emphasis in the popular understanding of what happened here at Gettysburg.
I believe that's all we have time for.
I'm sorry?
I believe that's all we have time for.
Okay, sorry about that. We're out of time.